Hello, this is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm joined again by Keith Preston to discuss the First World War. So I think we should start by covering some of the basic, commonly known causes of the First World War. French revanchism, which is the French national desire to regain Alsace-Lorraine after their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. That to me, I think, is the central feature, the central cause of the First World War, because I believe without the French revanchism, there would have been nothing to hold together the British and the Russians, because they all had their own independent and different imperial objectives. But the French objective was the only objective that could be achieved by a general conflict with Germany. A couple other issues are economic competition. Both Germany and Britain were conquering global markets. And Britain and Germany both knew that if there were more decades of peace, the Germans would easily conquer the rest of the global markets. And England, Lord Balfour wrote privately, or stated privately to one of our ambassadors, I think Henry White. He was the ambassador to Turkey. And he told White that, better a war now than later, before the English economy goes down the tank. And the other one is just nationalism in general. The great powers in the powder keg of the Balkans were all motivated by a kind of nationalistic arrogance that, they would all try to outcompete the other. And each nation was an armed camp, ready at the slightest spark to go. So what do you think about those generically acknowledged causes? Do you think I did a fair job of explaining them?
Well, those are all factors that certainly figured into the outbreak of the war, and historians generally recognize all of those as having been contributing factors to the war. One thing about World War I that's interesting is that because it's such a complicated war, it seems to have had so many causes and factors that made the war what it was, and contending parties and so forth, is that it really is an interesting opportunity to examine a wider question that historians have always looked at, and that is, what really makes history flow? Is it economic factors like the Marxists claim? Is it more a matter of power politics, like the Machiavellian tradition says? Is it more the war of ideas? Is it really are ideas really the force that guide history? And World War I is interesting to look at from the point of view of a question like that, because it seems to be a little bit of everything. On one hand, there were territorial issues, obviously. Nationalism was a really big part of it. A lot of people today, when they think about nationalism, they think about nationalism as being sort of a far right-wing type of concept, but it really wasn't in a historical sense. Historically, nationalism grew up during roughly the same time as classical liberalism and later socialism. The French Revolution, in some ways, had a very strong national component, in the sense it was about unifying the French-speaking peoples and eroding the sovereignty of the traditional provinces. Some of the critics of the French Revolution, like Alain de Benoist, for example, have talked about that. And throughout the 19th century, just as you were having liberal and socialist and Republican uprisings all over Europe, you were also having a lot of nationalist movements that were seeking to unify this or that state, usually people sharing a common ethnicity or language, like the Italians and the Germans and some others. And that sort of spread in the sense that everybody started saying, well, we want that too. So nationalism became a type of revolutionary force in a way during that same time period, the way that liberalism and socialism did. And by the early 20th century, you still had these various old-fashioned empires throughout Europe and Asia. You still had the German Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire. But parallel to that, you had the rise of nationalism. You had all of the nations, or I guess you could say they were ethnic groups within these empires that wanted independence or autonomy or something like that. And you also had the rise of liberal and socialist and democratic movements. Austria-Hungary, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, these were all monarchies. These were all societies that were in some way continuations of the ancient regime. In the number of other European countries, those countries had already become republics or democracies or de facto democracies. And you also had socialist parties that were prominent as well. And I think in some ways that the World War One was really a continuation of something that was happening during in the United States during the Civil War. When we were talking about American history in a previous podcast, I mentioned how I've long had this thesis that the American Civil War was in many ways a war between the forces of modernity and the Enlightenment and industrialism and liberalism and republicanism represented by the Union versus a more traditional European model society represented by the Confederacy. And this was, as much a class war between, say, nascent capitalism and remnant feudalism as it was anything else. And with the different ideologies and philosophies involved reflecting that as well. And I think a somewhat similar analysis can be applied to World War One in the sense that if you really look at how the different powers line up, what you see is that to a large degree, it's the forces of modernity. It's liberalism and democracy and socialism on one hand versus the more traditional monarchies on the other. Now, there are gray areas in that. For example, in Germany, for example, the SPD supported their own governments against the other nations. So there is some gray area in that. But what you do see in World War One is a lot of propaganda that emerges that among the Allied nations, depicting this as a war for democracy against Prussian militarism. In fact, when the United States entered the war, Woodrow Wilson and pro-war forces were saying this is a war to make the world safe for democracy, and the Germans and other monarchist states were depicted as reactionaries and all of that, and the Allies depicted themselves as progressive forces. In fact, for that reason, among others, there were a lot of people on the left, including the far left, that actually supported the war effort in ways that were kind of surprising. There were a lot of Frenchmen on the far left that supported the war on the grounds that this was a war for republicanism against Prussian militarism or against German monarchism, and you had similar sentiments being expressed elsewhere. Nationalism also played a big role in this. You saw people, even people that came from an anarchist background, suddenly becoming national patriots. You saw Peter Kropotkin, no less, becoming a Russian patriot during World War One, and you see Sebastian Frau, who was a leading anarchist in France, becoming a French patriot, and Benjamin Tucker, the American individualist anarchist who was living in France at the time, he also becomes a French patriot. So it really was a source of some interesting dividing lines.
Yeah. Some of the other, as far as the specific dominoes that started to fall, I think that the Franco-Russian Alliance, which was founded in 1892 and described by George Kennan in his monograph, The Fateful Alliance, which to my knowledge is the only English account of the Franco-Russian Alliance. And one of the things in here, this I think is what made a larger European war inevitable. As Kennan discusses, the French wanted Alsace-Lorraine and the Russians wanted Istanbul and some Turkish territories. The Russians realized the last Ottoman-Russian war was in 1877, I think, and they defeated the Ottomans very heavily, and were going to extract a pretty heavy peace treaty out of it. But the rest of Europe, at the Congress of Berlin, said, no, gotta stop that. You can't take all that land. And so the Russians kind of realized that if they wanted a free hand in the Balkans, they would have to get rid of Germany, which they viewed as the counterweight that prevented them from achieving their goals. And they both agreed secretly in 1892 and 1894 that they would come to each other's aid in a war against, of course, Germany. There was no clause for Britain or the United States or Japan. It was clearly against Germany. And it's funny, the Russian ambassadors were actually opposed to the treaty. They predicted that should a war arise, the Russian Empire would collapse and the Tsar would be killed, which is exactly what happened. But the Tsar didn't listen. Of course, this was, I think, Alexander the Third, not Nicholas II, who was Tsar at this time. And at this point, the Germans, the sort of moment where the Germans realized, something's going down, is when the Russian fleet docks in Toulouse and the French fleet docks in Kronstadt, which is a kind of diplomatic overture. And the Germans realize, okay, we need to defend ourselves. And so they begin a naval buildup under Tirpitz. And the naval buildup is important because in every Anglo history that I've read of the First World War, the English entry is always stated as well as because of it was the naval arms race. And they'll always say that if Germany had not built dreadnoughts, England would not have intervened. And it was Germany's mistake to build dreadnoughts and battleships. Now, on the face of it, the whole thing is bollocks. As J.F.C. Fuller points out in his trilogy of Western warfare, that as far as naval spending, the Russians, the French, and the British spent far more money in the 10 years leading up to World War I than Germany. The Russian budget increased by 5-fold, the French by 3-fold, and the British doubled. And the Germans only increased by 50%. And Fuller quotes Tirpitz as saying that they needed a navy in order to fight the French and the Russians, because if the French could blockade the North Sea ports, the Germans could be starved of resources from international trade. And the British themselves in 1907 concocted a conspiracy about the German dreadnoughts. You had the head of the Navy, Jackie Fisher. You had Lord Balfour from Parliament, and then you had Mulliner from the Coventry Ordnance Works. And they all had their interest in increasing spending for the Navy. And so they basically invented this myth that the Germans were rapidly building dreadnoughts that would leave the British Navy obsolete. Even Winston Churchill, not known for his specific tendencies, said that this whole thing was a farce and creating conflict between a peaceful neighbor. And the First Lord of the Admiralty, Fisher, wrote privately to the King of England that this whole thing was a farce and that there was no threat at all of a German naval supremacy. And England's real goal was the balance of power. The balance of power going back at least to Louis XIV. England would always back all the other European powers against the perceived dominant power. The head of Deutsche Bank in the 1890s said something to the effect that the only way to avoid war with England is to handicap German economic development, because if German economic development were to run apace, it would easily be the most powerful nation in Europe. And so this whole dreadnought farce, which is just a conspiracy by Mulliner and Fisher and Balfour to create basically more spending for the budget. Winston Churchill said that something to the effect that one side wanted 12 dreadnoughts, the other guy wanted 15. We compromised on 17. And after the war, Tirpitz reported that the whole point was the published figures of the German Navy were actually correct. They were from the German official documents, but they were 10 years earlier. They were publishing Germany's projected fleet in 1920 as if it would be that in 1914. And so this French alliance with Russia, and then coupled with England's questionable activity with manipulating information about the naval arms race, really made a war inevitable, because the goals that they wanted to achieve could only be achieved through a wider European conflagration.
Well, the World War I is a textbook example of some of the problems that are associated with what the American founding fathers called entangling alliances. I mean, if there was a situation where a massive conflagration was caused by so-called entangling alliances, this would have been it. You had all of this vast networks of secret treaties being established between these different powers that ended up being lured into the war because of a treaty obligation to defend all of these other nations, including nations they really didn't have anything in common with in many instances, where they may have actually had conflicting interests in many ways. So one of the things that came out of that after the war was the Wilson's idea of creating the League of Nations, the idea of select collective security. And the idea behind that was they wanted to eliminate these networks of treaties between nations for collective security that they had thought had led to this kind of problem. Instead, they'd have this kind of world federation of nations, and there would be collective security in the sense of one nation would essentially be prohibited from attacking another, as sort of an effort to de facto outlaw war. We know how well that turned out. But it really is an interesting example of some of the problems that are associated with these kinds of entangling alliances. And we see the same thing, ironically, going on today with NATO. There aren't really that many mainstream foreign policy commentators who talk about this, except for Pat Buchanan. He's the only one that I really know of that talks about this, and that is the fact that the United States keeps trying to extend NATO right up to Russia's border and bringing all of these Eastern European and Baltic nations into NATO, which essentially obligates NATO to defend all of those countries if they're ever in a conflict with Russia. And we know where that can lead, and we've seen problems there already with the issue in the Ukraine and Crimea last year. So there's always a danger of that repeating.
Yeah. The entangling alliances is very problematic. One of the methods of analysis that many left-wing critics of U.S. foreign policy apply is follow the money. They tend to see wars as being fought in the interests of corporate interests or financial interests, and that, for instance, in Vietnam or Iraq, they'll often point to this or that financial interest or obligation. But it's very telling that in World War I and World War II, well, let's stick to World War I for the moment, they completely, generally ignore that economic analysis. I mean, even John Maynard Keynes in his Economic Consequences of the Peace argued that World War I was a textbook example of England eliminating a trade rival.
Yeah, it is interesting how a lot of people on the left, I have noticed, don't really apply that kind of rigorous analysis to these wars that they do towards, say, the Cold War. Like the hard left, at least, I don't know that this is true of mainstream liberalism, but the hard left generally has this interpretation of the Cold War that interprets it as, American imperialism versus, Soviet, either Soviet Marxism or Soviet-led anti-imperialism or something like that, with economics being the basis of the geopolitical rivalry involved. Whereas in World War II, it's just the opposite. It's the war for democracy against the bad guy Nazis, and a lot of left-wing commentary on World War I that I have seen tends to be a mixed bag. You have more moderate leftists who continue to hold to the line that it was actually a war for democracy against monarchism and German militarism and all of that. You have a more radical left tradition that identifies with the anti-war point of view. And there was a strong anti-war left during that time, particularly in the United States. Which was crushed by the Wilson government, by the way. It was probably one of the most massive acts of repression carried out in American history. it was used as a pretext to crush not only the anti-war movement, but also the labor movement and all sorts of things. Eugene V. Debs, who was the leader of the Socialist Party, was actually put in prison for 20 years for treason for making an anti-war speech. In England, anti-war intellectuals like Bertrand Russell were put in jail for opposing the war. That war is in some ways interpreted as a capitalist catfight, if you will, between certain sections of the far left. The really far left, like the more Marxist influenced, certainly left anarchist influenced far left, tends to interpret aspects of World War I at least as sort of a capitalist dogfight. They less so with World War II. There are some far leftists that interpret World War II in that way as well, but the left is much more likely to interpret World War II as the holy war against fascism.
Yeah, it does seem to be one of the weaknesses in their interpretation. But one thing that should be pointed out, though, is the alliances that arrayed themselves against Germany, the Entente, which was England, France, and Russia, was by no means inevitable. In 1897, France and England almost went to war over a border dispute in the Sudan called the Fashoda Incident. And then in 1904, Russia and the Britain and the Russian-Franco Alliance almost went to war after the Dodger Bank incident. See, in 1904, Russia's Baltic Sea Fleet was sailing around the world to get back to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. And due to lack of discipline, they accidentally fired on some English fishing ships on Dodger Bank, thinking they were Japanese torpedo boats. And that almost led to a war with England. And so in many ways, these nations did have conflicting interests. Russia and England over Central Asia, France and England over African territories. But through shrewd diplomacy on the part of the French, they were able to wield these. England and France have been long-term rivals for 400, 500 years, and to finally bring it to a close was one of the great triumphs of the French. And to bring Russia and England together as well was a great triumph, because they've been, at least for over 100 years, competing over Central Asia. And it seems that being able to do that put them in a very strong position. And with the Ottoman Empire is interesting as well, because traditionally they had relied on the English for protection. I think of the Crimean War, where the Russians threatened the Ottoman Empire and gave them protection. But England we had to abandon the Ottoman Empire once Russia became their ally. And in many ways, England committed a mistake that we would see them commit again in the next World War, is that they would give Russia a blank check. Basically, their English policy since Napoleon had been to keep the Russians out of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And they were willing to give Russia Constantinople and much of the Balkans and Eastern Europe should they see the war to the end. Now, the Russian government collapsed under a revolution, so they didn't have to pay their end of the bargain. But the point is, that mistake was repeated in World War II with far more disastrous consequences, where the Russians were in the middle of Europe for 40 years. But England seems to be making the same mistake over and over again. The Russians should never be given a blank check. It's usually very dangerous.
Well, it's interesting to see how the First World War pitted these different forces against one another in such a way that it had such far-reaching consequences as well. I think that World War I sort of marks the transformation of war in a certain way. Well, I think it actually there's multiple ways in which the First World War is sort of a turning point in history, in the sense that it's a turning point in the nature of European war, whereas European war, since the time of Westphalia, since the 1648, at the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, when the state really starts to achieve a monopoly on war, during that 300-year period or so, war had not been particularly ideological in nature, in the sense that war often was more about territorial disputes and routine economic disputes and that kind of thing. It didn't really take on the kind of ideological tone that, say, the religious wars of earlier time periods had done, or modern ideological wars. But it does sort of mark a transition from this kind of traditional territorial concept of war. War is an instrument of policy, and it's just all about national interest, usually territorial and economic interest. And you start to see ideological concepts being introduced more into the war and the justification for war. As I said earlier, the American Civil War was kind of a dress rehearsal for this, in the sense that you do see this kind of apocalyptic view of war coming along, where it suddenly starts becoming acceptable to attack civilians and things of that nature. This kind of gentlemanly view of war starts to recede during the American Civil War, and I think that escalates significantly during the First World War, where it really does start to become the concept of a total war, where the entire society is mobilized, and there's a greater appeal to ideology as a justification for the war, as well as things like nationalism and all of that. And of course, one other aspect of the First World War that's important is the technological transformation. Bill Lind, in his theory about the different generations of war, the first, second, and third and fourth generation, argues that it was in World War I that second generation warfare really begins, where they kind of move away from this line and column model of fighting wars towards the emphasis on maneuvering and that kind of thing. And also, this was the first war in history where people fought with airplanes, where they had poison gas, where they had machine guns. So it really took war to a whole new level.
Yeah. As far as the way war was waged, the tremendous one of the things that has to be remembered is the last great European war was probably the Franco-Prussian War, and some nations hadn't even been at war, say for instance Belgium, since maybe Napoleon. And a lot of the Europeans still fought in that old fashion because the technology had exceeded their ability to catch up with strategies and tactics. The machine gun, high explosive artillery, barbed wire, modern bolt action rifles made the cavalry charge fairly obsolete, except in the wide open spaces of Eastern Europe, Poland and Russia, which would still be popular into the 1920s with the Civil War in Russia. But on the Western Front, the Balkan Front, and the Italian Front is completely ineffective. And that's what was partly responsible for these atrocious body counts. Is the generals really didn't know how to deal with these new weapons. They fought Napoleon's war with machine guns, and it just didn't work. As far as the sort of 0 hour, the month of July, which was the decisive month after the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, of the immediate lead up to the war, one of the most important things to recognize is the reasons why the Serbian Black Hand murdered the Crown Prince of Austria. One of the things that I've always wondered is that you never read in the textbooks, what was the motivation of the Black Hand? Why, other than some vague nationalism, what was their true goal? Now, the Black Hand was a terrorist organization in Serbia based on the premise of creating Greater Serbia, what we would know as Yugoslavia. And the head of Serbian military intelligence ran this organization. So it went right up to the top of the Serbian government. Now, the reason why they killed the Crown Prince, according to both Apis, which is the code name of the Minister of Intelligence, and Gavrilo Princip, who actually shot the Archduke, was that there was a series of reforms that the Archduke was going to implement that would remove the ethnic crisis brewing in the empire. The Austrian Empire was a hodgepodge of different ethnic groups: Croats, Slovenians, Hungarians, Austrians, Czechs, Italians, and it was a real boiling mess of nationalistic fervor. And they were trying to figure out, how can we solve this problem to make sure the empire could survive? And they essentially settled on a model not too dissimilar from the Swiss and American federal systems, where each group would be given representation and they would hopefully be able to diffuse the ethnic tensions, especially amongst the South Slav population. And the threat was seen as so credible that if the South Slavs had been placated in Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia, then any sort of attempt to create greater Yugoslavia would fail because they couldn't tap into that dissent. And so they realized if they didn't kill the Archduke, then they would never be able to create greater Yugoslavia. And what's very interesting is that the Russian attaché to Serbia, who was witnessing some military drills in Serbia, was reported to have told Apis that when he was informed about the assassination plot, he says, "Don't worry. If worse comes to worse, we'll go to war for you." So we often hear of Germany's blank check to Austria, which is, of course, nothing of the sort, as I'll get into. Russia actually did give a blank check to Serbia, because we have to know that Serbia would never have done something as risky as kill the heir apparent of their largest neighbor, which could easily precipitate an invasion, without, of course, knowledge that they'd be backed up by Russia. Now, the so-called blank check was Germany's support for Austria. Now, all of that really amounted to was a punitive expedition. Well, actually, first of all, Austria had given an ultimatum to Serbia. And the Serbians accepted pretty much every point in the ultimatum except one of the most important, which was handing over the chief of Serbian military intelligence to be tried by Austrians, because they feared correctly that the Serbs would cover it up and hush it up so that he would escape justice and further terrorist activity could continue in the future. And they said no. So Austria, now a punitive expedition was not unusual. For instance, in the Sudan in the 1880s, British sent a punitive expedition under Chinese Gordon to rescue some English hostages of the Mahdi. And in the China in the 1900, there was the Boxer Rebellion, where the United States, Japan, Britain, Russia, Germany had sent an expeditionary force as a punitive expedition to rescue missionaries and Western individuals. So this had a precedent within European dispute resolution practices. But of course, at this point, there's too much on the line. The Russians couldn't back down. The British themselves did not want Serbia to fall to the Central Powers because it could allow the completion of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, which would link Berlin to Iraq and the untapped oil reserves of the Middle East. Serbia was the only nation that was hostile to Germany's interests, standing between the completion of that railroad. And so they had no reason to see Serbia fall either. And so they backed Serbia up. And now Austria had no intention of conquering Serbia. In fact, the Germans gave Russians very clear statements that we do not support any territorial annexation of Serbia, only a punitive expedition to ensure that they give over the guilty parties for justice. Of course, that had never been the goal of the Russians or the British or the French. And so the so-called blank check was just that, so-called. The actual blank check was the one France gave to Russia. They knew that if Russia mobilized, that a European war would be inevitable. And they basically told Russia, yeah, do whatever, we're going to back you up. And then the Russians mobilized against the Austrians and the Germans mobilized against the Russians, and the French mobilized against the Germans. And then the Germans, to invade France, implemented their Schlieffen plan to invade through Belgium, which Britain used as a convenient pretext to attack Germany. They claimed that, we can't violate neutral powers, even though in 1916, they launched a coup d'etat against a pro-German king of Greece to allow their troops from the failed Gallipoli landing to land in Salonika. And they also invaded Persia to link up with the Russians. So it was clearly a pretext. The rights of neutrals to England was of no consequence whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting how, given how complicated the causes of the war were, that after the war was over, Germany really started to become saddled with war guilt. Suddenly all of a sudden the whole thing was Germany's fault, even though it's obviously that there were many different parties that contributed to making the war what it was. But I think that in turn is an indication of what an ideological war this was. I think it was, the justification for it had to do with the saddling Germany with the kind of war guilt and the reparations and all of that at Versailles had to do with the fact that Germany was considered to be this reactionary nation and was blamed for the war by the victorious democratic powers that essentially set the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which is ironic, though, when you think about how the Allies had actually been aligned with the Russian Empire, which is arguably even more reactionary than the Germans were at the time. So it's really interesting how that kind of spin got put on all of this.
Yeah. Now, after the war starts, the next important entry is that, of course, of the United States. And I would argue that a lot of very good revisionist historical work has been done in recent years by libertarian historians, such as Ralph Riggenbach and Ralph Rako, or Jeff Riggenbach and Ralph Rako, among others. They've done some very good work in explaining some of the minutiae of how the United States entered into the war. And the idea that the United States was a neutral power is really a myth, because to be a neutral, you can't be prejudiced for either side. But the United States, more correctly, was a co-belligerent, because from the very beginning of the war, we were supplying the British and French with munitions, loans, weapons, armaments, but not to the Germans. And U.S. opinion of Germany was manipulated by the British, and this gets into the propaganda that you mentioned earlier. The British cut the transatlantic cables from Germany to the United States, so only Britain had a voice in America about how the war was, why it was being fought, and how it was being fought. And the United States President Woodrow Wilson, a known Anglophile, essentially in 1915 promised Lord Grey that they would enter the war on the side of the Allies. He just needed time to get things going, get the Americans ready for a war. And again, as you pointed out, the repression of the Wilson years was extreme. German Americans were highly repressed. One of the ironies of history is that the Jewish American population was so pro-German in the First World War that they actually had to fight a suit against, I think, the federal government, because they were seen as unreliable. Other pro-German elements were also the Irish, and they were also repressed. Much like we saw in the Iraq War with the replacement of French fries with freedom fries, everything German was renamed. Dachshunds were renamed, hamburgers were renamed, and it's really, really kind of ridiculous and over the top. But really, it's about the money. As Smedley Butler pointed out in War is the Racket, the United States had to fight in the First World War because they had indebted themselves to the Allied powers so much that if the Allied powers lost, they wouldn't get paid back. And so they did the cost-benefit calculation and realized that a war was cheaper than not getting paid back by a defeated France and England.
Yeah, that gets back to the point I raised earlier in the discussion about what really causes incidents like this. Is it really ideology? Is it economics? Is it geopolitical relations, just routine power politics? And I think all of that enters into it to some degree. The Americans, it's interesting that the Americans and the British had this reconciliation by this point, because as everyone knows, the Americans had seceded from England more than a century earlier. We'd actually fought a war on American soil twice, first the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812. But then over time, what we see is the American power elite or ruling class or whatever starting to gradually realign itself with England and becoming increasingly more friendly to England. And as you said, Woodrow Wilson himself was actually kind of an Anglophile. Well, another thing that was interesting was that by the time of World War I, American nationalism had really become predominant, that the cleavages that we saw during the Civil War by that time had started to mend themselves in a way. And a lot of the American South, then as now, had started to become very nationalistic. And in fact, Wilson himself was from Virginia. His birthplace is actually not too far from where I grew up. So by this time, we have this fervent American nationalism that's emerged in the United States, and we have this Anglophilia that's emerged among the power elite, if you will, among the ruling class. And then we also have this Wilsonian idea of, like I said earlier, make the world safe for democracy, a war to end all wars, trying to essentially bringing this kind of Enlightenment, kind of Jacobin ideology into the justification for the war. At the same time, harshly repressing the left. The radical left in the United States at that time was a pretty radical left. There was the IWW, there was a Socialist Party, there were the anarchists, there were a lot of these immigrant communities that you mentioned, the Jewish and German and Italian and Irish. A lot of those actually formed the basis of the very radical left, the labor left in those days, which interestingly enough was in mortal conflict with the progressive left. Wilson himself was a progressive. He was a liberal for his time. He was considered part of the progressive movement. This was the height of the progressive era. And by the standards of his time, he was very much a progressive, and yet he harshly repressed the labor movement and anti-war movement and all of that. He reinstituted, I would say, consolidated or expanded racial segregation in the United States while going to war with Germany in the name of these ostensibly liberal ideals, a democracy and all of that. So, interesting bit of contradiction.
Yes. The so far as what guides history, ideology or economic interests or power plays, I really don't think you can isolate it to any one issue, because in some sense, Wilson had this sort of utopian messianic vision of the world. And in many ways, he was, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but he was really outplayed at Versailles by the more cynical realpolitik of the day. So one could argue that maybe Wilson was a true believer of sorts. And people like Clemenceau and Lloyd George are more cynical in that regard. But yeah, I think it's probably a combination of those. But I do find it very interesting, again, that in World War I and World War II, leftist historians never analyze them from a financial perspective. They always try to, imply guilt in the Iraq War or Vietnam or wherever else by following the money trail to who's paying for this and why. But they're strangely mum when it comes to World War I and World War II, where the money interests were hardly secret at all, especially after the war. After World War I, you had a tremendous backlash against American involvement in the war. And you had the Neutrality Acts that were passed after certain investigations by the Nye Commission, NYE. He basically confirmed what Smedley Butler had said. It was all about the money. They'd gotten and that's why they made it difficult for the United States to lend to the Allies in World War II. Roosevelt, of course, just didn't care and just violated those laws anyhow. But the American people learned that after the war and tried to put measures in place to prevent America from being led along again by that. But in many ways that they failed and to do that, to protect themselves against that again.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to consider how powerful anti-war sentiment was, not only in America, but also even in Europe, but particularly in England after World War I. World War I, when it was done, was widely, and I think correctly, regarded as a tragedy, as a disaster. In fact, Bertrand Russell once said that no one that was born before 1914 knew what it meant to be truly happy. And what he meant by that is that the Europe of the late 19th and early 20th century had become, a fairly, I wouldn't say idyllic place, but a peaceful place with relatively moderate governments and things of that nature. And then all of a sudden, you had this biggest war in world history, and with a total war that involved the civilian population and all of this new technology, machine guns and airplanes and all kinds of things that had never been available before. And after it was over, there were millions of casualties, civilian and military. About the same number of civilians died in the war as soldiers. I mean, the casualty total in World War I was about 7 or 8 million civilians and soldiers alike, so about 15, 16, 17 million people died in this particular war. And a lot of people, I looked at it like, well, what have we done? And for that reason, anti-war sentiment was very strong. There were books like Johnny, Get Your Gun that were published during this time. And when the build up to World War II started, that's why we had such a strong anti-war movement in the United States during the build up to World War II. We had America First and movements like that were saying, well, let's not do that again. And even in Europe as well, particularly in England, you had an anti-war movement in England that was opposed to England entering into a new war with Germany. And of course, nowadays, all of that, by mainstream historians and political theorists today, all of that is attacked, as people today will say, well, the America First movement or someone like Neville Chamberlain in England, they foolishly wanted to appease Hitler, and look what happened. They let Hitler get out of control and all of that. But that's, when we talked about World War II in a previous podcast, we went over some of the problems with that from a historical perspective. But if anything, I think the anti-war movements that emerged after World War I were largely on the right track, in the sense that they realized that the kind of weaponry that was available for modern warfare was too destructive for these kinds of wars to continue. And in fact, after World War II, that's kind of what happened. One of the positive side effects of the invention of nuclear weapons and things like that is that it sort of raised the cost of war, where this kind of interstate total wars became cost prohibitive. But the anti-war sentiment in the United States after World War I was so strong that by the time that the Roosevelt was trying to maneuver the U.S. into World War I, and the politicians in his party that supported him, you would have public demonstrations against some of these politicians, with things like hanging them in effigy and that kind of stuff, and that regrettably, that kind of anti-war sentiment, I think, just totally disappeared once Pearl Harbor happened and once the Second World War began, and it didn't really make a comeback until the anti-Vietnam War movement. But it's really a shame that the West didn't learn its lesson from the First World War and went and repeated the same thing again. And I think that the vengefulness of the Treaty of Versailles is really a big part of that. And I think that Woodrow Wilson's entry into World War I was a big part of that. I think Woodrow Wilson's entry of the United States into World War I really made the conflict a little bit lopsided and more or less ensured Germany's devastating defeat. That in turn led to what happened at Versailles, which in turn led to the Second World War.
Yeah. You mentioned the statement about nobody before 1914 knows what it's like to be happy. The Jewish author Stefan Zweig, in his book The World of Yesterday, basically describes the world prior to the First World War. And it really is, again, not to be utopian about it, but it really was fairly idyllic. You had slowly, steadily rising standards of material conditions of living. You had relatively limited governments. They were not these totalitarian, absolutist monstrosities of the 20th century, as we see in the Nazis and the Soviet communist governments, nor were they the repressive ancient regimes of the Ottoman, well, you saw Ottomans, but not like the old sultans or czars or emperors of the past. And another thing that's changed, now I don't know if it's directly related to the war, but in an interesting documentary called Century of the Self, in that documentary, they discuss the idea of the self and sort of psychology. And prior to the First World War, not just in England, where the saying "a stiff upper lip" is kind of a parable, but all throughout Europe and America, the idea that you would show emotion and be emotional was just unacceptable. You generally, in public, had to have a solid front. You might, if you needed to cry, you did it in private. You didn't do it in public. After World War I, that's totally different. People just explode. You have revolutions in Germany and Russia, civil unrest in England and France. And you have the rising theory of psychology led by Sigmund Freud, where he talks about repressed desires. And in many ways, the repression of those desires prior to 1914 led to facilitated that state, and the unleashing of those desires during the revolutions after the war, and then leading up and then through World War II and the Cold War, led us to the brink of extinction numerous times, which we mercifully avoided. They were nearing the end of our first section. Thanks for coming on, Keith. Looking forward to having you on for part 2. This is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.